close your eyes for a moment. The cold hits you first. Not the comfortable cold of an open window on an autumn evening. This is something older and meaner. The kind of cold that has been sitting on this plain for months, that has soaked into the soil and frozen the rivers solid, and silenced every living thing for miles in every direction. You're standing in the middle of Russia. The year is 1613, and what surrounds you is not winter. It is the aftermath of a country that tried to destroy itself. The fields are empty. The roads are empty. The villages, or what is left of them, are empty too, their doorframes standing open like mouths that have forgotten how to speak. If you listen carefully, underneath the silence you can hear it. The distant creak of an abandoned cart, the low moan of wind through a burned roof, and the smell. And yes, even through all this cold there is a smell of charred wood and old ash. The particular smell of fires that were not accidents, of homes that were not left. They were taken. Russia is not sleeping. Russia is dying. For the past 15 years, this land has been consumed by what historians would later call smutnoye vremya, the time of troubles. It began with the dynasty's end. Even the terrible, that towering and terrifying figure left behind a broken empire and a broken line of succession. His son Fyodor, gentle and unfit to rule, died without an heir, and into that vacuum chaos poured like floodwater through a cracked dam. Pretenders rose and fell. False czars, men who claimed to be long-dead princes resurrected by ambition and desperation, swept across the land gathering followers. Famine came, the kind of famine that hollows a country from the inside out, that turns neighbours into enemies and empties entire provinces of life. Plague followed famine, as it always does, and then the armies came. Polish forces pressing from the west, Swedish forces from the north, each one eager to carve a piece from the carcass of a once great empire. Moscow itself fell. The Kremlin, the very heart of Russia, that fortress of golden domes and ancient walls, occupied by foreign soldiers who stabled their horses inside Orthodox churches. If you had walked through Red Square in those years, you would not have found traders or pilgrims or the sound of church bells. You would have found silence, ash, and the slow creep of despair. Russia had no Tsar, and without a Tsar in the Russian understanding of the world there was no order, no God on earth, no protection from the void. But before we go deeper into this 300-year saga, I'd love to know who is joining us on this journey. Please, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I'd love to check the comments and see how far these echoes of history have travelled. It was into this world, this broken, bleeding, desperate world, that a boy would be asked to become a god. The Ipatiev monastery sits on the banks of the Kostroma River, modest and ancient, its white walls holding the cold at bay, its interior smelling of beeswax candles and incense, and the particular dusty holiness of a place where prayers have soaked into the stone for centuries. In the winter of 1613, a 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov was living there with his mother, Martha. They were not hiding exactly, but they are not advertising their presence either. The Romanovs were a Boyar family, connected by blood and marriage to the old ruling house, and in these dangerous times, noble blood was more liability than asset. Pretenders had risen and died, Tsars had been murdered at their beds. Being important in Russia in 1613 meant being a target. Imagine young Mikhail, thin-faced, pale from the winter, dressed in the plain robes of a monastery guest rather than the silks his birth might have warranted. He was not a warrior. He was not a statesman. By most accounts, he was a quiet, somewhat sickly boy who had grown up watching the world of Russian politics consume everyone who touched it. He had survived the time of troubles by staying small, staying still, staying invisible. And then the delegation arrived. They came from Moscow, a group of boyars, clergy, and representatives of what remained of the Russian governing assembly, the Zemsky Sobor. They had debated for weeks, even months, about who should wear the crown. They needed someone with legitimate blood ties to the old dynasty. They needed someone the fractured nobility could accept. They needed, in truth, someone that no single powerful faction could claim as their own puppet, which paradoxically made a young, inexperienced boy more appealing, not less. They had chosen Mikhail Romanov. Now picture the scene as they told him. The boy stood in that cold stone room, the monks chanting, audible through the walls, and he wept. This is not legend or embellishment. Contemporary accounts describe Mikhail's reaction to the news as one of genuine terror and grief. He refused. He said he was too young, too untested, too unworthy. His mother Martha, standing beside him, refused on his behalf. She wept too, and her weeping was not performance. She had watched what Russia did to Tsars, and she had no desire to send her only son into that fire. The delegation knelt. They begged. They held icons before him, images of the Virgin, of Christ, and told him that to refuse was to abandon Russia to chaos and damnation. They told him God had chosen him. They told him the weight of an entire civilization rested on his thin 16-year-old shoulders. Can you feel that weight? Not metaphorically, literally. The monomach's cap, the ancient jewel-encrusted crown of the Russian Tsars, was a heavy thing. Heavy with gold, heavy with rubies and sapphires, heavy with the accumulated meaning of centuries of rule. When it was placed on a young head, it did not sit lightly. It pressed down. It demanded something from the skull beneath it. Mikhail Romanov accepted the crown in February of 1613. He walked out of the Ipatiev monastery and into history. The Romanov dynasty had begun, but it had almost ended before it started, because not everyone wanted a new Russian Tsar. The Polish forces still occupying parts of Russia had a vested interest in keeping the country headless and weak. And word travelled. Word that a boy had been found, crowned, elevated. Word that Russia was beginning to coalesce around a name. Word reached a detachment of Polish soldiers moving through the forests and frozen fields of the Kostroma region. Their orders were simple, if monstrous. Find the young Tsar. End the dynasty before it could truly begin. But the forests of Russia in winter are not like forests anywhere else in the world. They are vast beyond comprehension, layered and dark, the pine trees standing so close together that the light disappears within 100 yards of the tree line. The paths twist, the landmarks vanish under snowfall. A man who does not know these woods, who was not born listening to them, is not navigating. He is simply wandering, waiting to die. The Polish soldiers needed a guide, and in a village along their path they found one. His name was Ivan Susanin. He was a peasant, an older man, a farmer, the kind of figure that history almost never remembers because his kind were never meant to be remembered. He had no title, no army, no weapon more significant than the knowledge carried inside his own body. The knowledge of every frozen stream, every hidden bog, every deceptive clearing in the forest he had walked his entire life. The Polish soldiers told him what they needed. Guide us. Take us to the boy Tsar. And Ivan Susanin looked at them, and he agreed. He led them into the forest as darkness gathered. He walked with the confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going. The soldiers followed, their horses struggling through the deepening snow, their torches throwing pale circles of orange light against the dark trees. Deeper, deeper still. The path, if it had ever truly been a path, dissolved. The trees pressed closer. The ground beneath the snow became treacherous, soft in ways that solid ground should not be soft. Susanin was leading them into the marshlands, into the frozen bogs where the ice was thin and the black water beneath was deep and cold and patient. The soldiers realized eventually what was happening. There are no precise records of the confrontation. History does not always give us its most important moments in clean detail. But what we know is this. Ivan Susanin died in that forest. The soldiers killed him when they understood his betrayal. And then the forest took them too, one way or another, lost in the cold and the dark and the swamp, far from any road, far from any village, far from the boy they had come to kill. Mikhail Romanov survived. The dynasty survived. Because of a peasant who chose, in one frozen night, to spend everything he had. They say that among the monks of the Ipatiev monastery, in the days after the coronation, there was a whispered thing. Not a prophecy written in any book, not an official pronouncement, just words passed between old men and candlelit corridors, the kind of words that come when something momentous has happened and the human mind reaches instinctively for meaning. What begins in a monastery will end in a basement. Perhaps it was said. Perhaps it was invented later by people looking backward through the lens of catastrophe, finding patterns in the dark. History is full of such moments, where the ending seems to have written itself into the beginning, if only you know where to look. What we know is this. On that February day in 1613, a frightened boy accepted a crown he did not want, carried on the backs of a people who had nothing left to give. He would go on to rule for 32 years. He would stabilize a broken country. He would begin a dynasty that would last 300 years, 3 centuries of glory and excess and ambition and cruelty and breathtaking beauty and unimaginable suffering. 300 years. The Romanovs had saved Russia, but the world was not standing still while Russia recovered. Across the Baltic, across the plains of Europe, something was changing. A new kind of thinking, a new kind of power, a new understanding of what a nation could be. Science, trade, navies, engineering. The modern world was being built, and Russia, vast, ancient, magnificent Russia, was watching from the outside. Someone would have to drag it through the door, and somewhere, in the chaos of the royal court, a boy was being born. A boy who would grow to nearly 7 feet tall. A boy with enormous hands and an insatiable curiosity and a rage for transformation that would reshape this entire empire from its foundations upward. He would call himself something that no Russian Tsar had ever called himself before. He would call himself Emperor. That title was more than just a name. It was a declaration of war against the old world. But before this emperor could reshape a civilization, he first had to strip away his own divinity. By the summer of 1697, the gilded isolation of the Kremlin was 1,000 miles away, replaced by the salt spray and pine resin of an Amsterdam shipyard. Here, the air was thick with the scent of fresh timber and the sharp, honest sweat of men labouring under an open sky. Hammers ring against timber, ropes the thickness of a man's arm drag massive beams across the dock. Gulls wheel overhead, and among the workers, the carpenters and caulkers and riggers and sailmakers, all of them ordinary men doing an ordinary day's work, there is one figure who is not ordinary at all. He is tall, extraordinarily, almost unsettlingly tall, 6 feet and 8 inches in an era when most men barely cleared 5.5. He moves through the crowd not with the ceremonial drift of a man accustomed to deference, but with a driven, almost frantic energy, leaning over the work of other men, asking questions faster than translators can answer them, picking up tools and turning them in his enormous hands with the focused intensity of a child who has just discovered fire. His face is handsome but restless, marked by a slight nervous twitch near his right eye. His hands are stained with grease and ink. His clothes are the plain, practical clothes of a Dutch workman. Nobody bows to him. Nobody calls him Your Majesty. He's introduced himself as Peter Mikhailov, a Russian gentleman travelling to learn the shipbuilding trade. His name is Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov, and he is the Tsar of all Russia. But we will come back to Amsterdam, because to understand why the most powerful man in Russia was standing in a foreign shipyard with blisters on his hands, you need to go back to a night of fire and screaming in the Kremlin, back to the moment that made him. Peter was 10 years old in the spring of 1682, and he had already learned that the world was a dangerous place. The Russian court was a nest of competing factions, great noble families called boyars, each one angling for influence over the young Tsar and his sickly half-brother Ivan. Peter's mother, Natalia, belonged to one faction. The powerful Miloslavsky family belonged to another. And controlling the balance between them, barely, were the Streltsy, the elite military regiments whose loyalty could be purchased, whose anger, once ignited, was almost impossible to contain. Someone ignited it in May of 1682. A rumour spread through the Streltsy ranks that the Narishkins, Peter's mother's family, had murdered the Tsarevich Ivan. The rumour was false. It didn't matter. The soldiers were already moving. Picture the scene as a 10-year-old boy would have experienced it. The sudden commotion in the palace corridors, the sound of shouting from somewhere below, then screaming, a different kind of sound entirely, the sound of men in real terror, his mother gripping his hand, and then the Streltsy, pouring into the Kremlin courtyard like a tide that has been building behind a wall for years and has finally found its breach. Peter's uncle was thrown from a window onto the spears of the soldiers waiting below. His mother's advisors, men he had known his whole life, men who had spoken to him with careful, elaborate courtesy, were dragged through the halls and butchered in the open air while the boy watched. For 3 days the killings continued, 3 days of blood and noise and helplessness, while Peter stood in the palace and understood, with the particular clarity that only childhood terror can produce, that power in old Moscow was always provisional, always one rumour away from collapse. He never forgot it. The twitching in his face, a nervous tic that would follow him for the rest of his life, began in those 3 days. So did something else. A deep, cellular revulsion toward everything the old Moscow represented. The Kremlin, with its labyrinthine politics and its superstitious nobility, and its resistance to any idea that had not already been approved by tradition and the Orthodox Church. He wanted out, not just personally, he wanted Russia out. He would spend the rest of his life trying to drag an entire civilization through a door it could not even see. But first, he needed to understand what was on the other side of that door. The Great Embassy set out from Moscow in the spring of 1697. On the surface, it was a diplomatic mission. 250 Russians travelling through Europe to negotiate alliances and study Western methods of statecraft. Beneath the surface, one of those 250 travellers was the Tsar himself, travelling under a false name, deliberately anonymous, hungry to see and learn and absorb things that no diplomatic protocol would ever let him access as a monarch. He visited Prussia. He visited the Netherlands. He actually worked, with his hands in the VOC shipyard at Zaandam for weeks. He watched master shipwrights plan and cut and assemble vessels that could cross oceans, and he asked them to teach him everything. He moved to Amsterdam when the Zaandam craftsmen grew too distracted by the spectacle of a 7-foot Russian nobleman pretending to be a labourer. In Amsterdam, the work continued. He learned to draft ship plans. He studied navigation, fortification, anatomy. He visited museums and workshops and dissecting theatres with the same voracious, slightly overwhelming appetite for knowledge. He watched a Dutch surgeon perform a dissection and reportedly demanded to participate, forcing his squeamish Russian companions to touch the cadaver so they would lose their fear of it. This was not a king on a tour. This was a man in a state of controlled desperation, trying to compress decades of Western development into months of personal education, because he understood something most of his contemporaries did not. Russia was falling behind, and the gap was widening, and the only way to close it was not to borrow Western ideas cautiously and selectively, but to seize them wholesale, violently, immediately. He came back to Moscow in 1698 with notebooks full of plans and a mind full of fire. The Russia he returned to was exactly the Russia he'd left. Ancient, slow, thick with tradition, every nobleman still wearing the long robes and full beards that mark them as properly, piously Russian. In the Orthodox tradition, the beard was not merely fashion, it was theology. God had made man in his image, and to shave the beard was to deface that image. The beard was dignity and piety and identity all at once. Peter picked up a razor at his own homecoming feast and began shaving his nobles himself. Not symbolically, not one token gesture for the painters to record. He moved around the room with the same restless physical directness he brought to everything, and he shaved them, laughing when they flinched, brooking no argument, personally removing the beards of men who had worn them their entire lives as an act of religious devotion. Those who wanted to keep their beards in public were eventually permitted to do so, at a cost, an annual beard tax with a copper token to be carried as proof of payment. The amount varied by social class. The message did not vary at all. This is not your country anymore, it is mine, and I am remaking it. He banned traditional Russian robes and mandated Western dress. He restructured the military, the government, the calendar. He dragged Russia's administrative systems into something approximating European modernity through a combination of genuine vision and breathtaking coercion. For every noble who embraced the new order with enthusiasm, there were 10 who complied out of fear, and 100 peasants who watched the changes from a distance and understood only that the world they had known was being dismantled by a Tsar who seemed to be at war with God and tradition simultaneously. Peter did not care. He had seen what Europe was building, and he had felt the gap like a wound. Every year of Russian stagnation was another year of falling further behind. There was no time for gentleness, but a modern state needed a modern capital. Moscow was the old Russia, Byzantine, landlocked, looking inward. Peter's Russia needed to look outward, toward the Baltic, toward the sea lanes that connected Europe's great powers to each other and to the world's wealth. He needed a city of stone and water, a window, as he himself would call it, cut through to the west. He had found his location, a stretch of frozen marshland at the mouth of the Neva River on the edge of the Baltic Sea in territory that technically still belonged to Sweden. The land was sodden and treacherous, barely above the waterline, prone to flooding. Engineers told him it was nearly impossible to build on. The climate was brutal. There was nothing there, No city, no infrastructure, no foundation of any kind. Peter told him to begin anyway. He would have his city. He would have his window. And if the cost of that window was measured in human lives, if the frozen mud of the Neva Delta had to be broken by 100,000 pairs of hands, many of which would stop moving long before the work was done, then that was the cost, and Russia would pay it. What rises from that swamp will be one of the most beautiful cities in the history of human civilization. What lies beneath it is something else entirely. That something else was a sensory nightmare of grey water and suffocating mist. By the autumn of 1703, the mouth of the Neva River offered no promise of a grand capital, only a thick, low, colourless fog. It sat on the water like a held breath, swallowing the horizon and turning the world into a grey, formless void in every direction. The river itself is dark, not the romantic darkness of deep still water, but the murky, restless darkness of a delta that can't decide whether it is land or sea. Dozens of small islands break the surface, none of them solid enough to trust, all of them threaded together by channels and inlets that shift with the seasons and the tides. The ground beneath your boots, where there is ground, is not ground so much as a suggestion of ground, a thin crust of mud and reed and decaying vegetation floating above cold water that has no bottom you can comfortably imagine. The mosquitoes are extraordinary. In summer they rise from the marsh in clouds dense enough to darken the air. Malaria lives here. Scurvy lives here. The Baltic wind comes off the water in winter with a particular ferocity. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill you but seems to carry a personal animosity, pressing through every layer of clothing to find the warmth at your core and extinguish it methodically. The land floods regularly, catastrophically sometimes, when the wind pushes the Baltic backward up the Neva and the river simply swallows everything along its banks. No sane architect standing here in 1703 would look at this place and think, city. Peter the Great was not interested in sanity. He was interested in geometry. He stood on this marsh, this impossible, hostile, waterlogged nowhere, and he saw straight lines. He saw canals and boulevard and grand facades of stone looking out over wide water toward the open Baltic, and beyond that toward Amsterdam and London, and everything he had spent years hungering for. He saw Russia's future, and he pointed at the mud with his sword, and he told the men around him to begin. He called it Sankt Petersburg, St. Peter's City, named for his patron saint, and perhaps also, in the way of men who have large enough egos, a little bit for himself. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and most brutal construction projects in human history. The ukaz went out, the imperial decree, and across the vast breadth of Russia, men were conscripted, not volunteers, not paid labourers attracted by competitive wages and good working conditions. Conscripted men, tens of thousands of them, torn from their villages and their families and their fields and marched or transported to the Neva Delta to build the Tsar's dream. Estimates vary, as they always do when records are incomplete, and the powerful have reasons to obscure the true cost of their ambitions. But historians believe that somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 workers died during the construction of St. Petersburg. Some put the figure higher. They came without adequate tools. This is not a rhetorical flourish or an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It is documented fact. In the earliest years of construction, there were not enough wheelbarrows, not enough shovels, not enough of the basic implements that make large-scale earth-moving possible. So the men carried the earth. They dug with their hands and with sticks and with whatever else they could improvise, and they carried the mud and soil in their shirts, bundling the fabric up into makeshift sacks against their chests and hauling it to where it needed to go, and then going back for more. Walk forward in your imagination through a morning of that work. The cold water soaking through your boots, the weight of wet mud against your body, the fog never fully lifting, the mosquitoes in summer and the frost in autumn, and the knowledge somewhere underneath everything that you did not choose to be here and cannot choose to leave. Scurvy came for the men whose diets were insufficient, which was most of them, their gums bleeding, their joints aching with a deep bone pain that made every load of mud feel like punishment. Malaria came with the standing water and the mosquitoes, cycling through the labour camps in waves, taking men in the night with fevers that spiked and broke and spiked again until there was nothing left to break. Dysentery moved through the camps quietly and efficiently. The cold took those whose bodies had already been weakened by everything else. The dead were buried where they fell, beneath the foundations of the buildings, beneath the embankments and the roads, beneath what would become some of the most spectacular architecture in the world, the formal gardens and the gilded spires and the long, elegant facades of pale yellow and green and white stone that would one day make visitors from across Europe catch their breath in genuine astonishment. There is a phrase that attached itself to this city almost from the beginning, passed in whispers from one generation to the next, that St. Petersburg was not built on stone, as its architects claimed, but on bones. The bones of the men who carried mud in their shirts, who died of fever in the camps, who slipped into the dark water of the Neva channels and were not pulled out. Every beautiful thing above the ground has its counterweight below it, and yet the work continued, because Peter's will was not a force that obstacles deflected. It was a force that consumed obstacles, ground them down, moved through them like that Baltic wind moves through inadequate clothing, finding the core and pressing on. He needed this city to exist, and he needed it quickly, because the world outside Russia's borders was not waiting politely for him to finish. Sweden was in the way. In the early 18th century, Sweden was not the peaceful northerly country of careful foreign policy and excellent furniture it would eventually become. It was a military empire, the dominant power of northern Europe, controlling the Baltic coastline and most of the access points between Russia and the Western world. Its king, Charles XII, was one of those figures that history occasionally produces with unsettling frequency in this period. A young man of extraordinary military talent and absolute fearlessness, who seemed constitutionally incapable of knowing when to stop. He was 18 years old when he took the throne. He spent almost his entire reign at war, and he was brilliant at it in the specific and limited way that a person can be brilliant at something that is ultimately going to destroy them. Peter moved against Swedish territory in 1700 as part of a coalition with Denmark and Poland, expecting that Swedish power could be dismantled with coordinated pressure. Charles proved him wrong immediately. At the Battle of Narva in November of 1700, a Swedish force of roughly 8,000 men attacked a Russian army of nearly 40,000 and shattered it completely, capturing most of Peter's artillery and leaving the Russian military humiliated in front of all of Europe. It would have broken a lesser man. It broke, instead, Peter's remaining patience with halfway measures. He went back to Russia, and he looked around at what he had, and he began converting it, with characteristic ferocity, into what he needed. He issued orders to melt down ancient church bells, bronze bells that had hung in Orthodox towers for generations, that had marked the rhythm of Russian religious life for centuries, that were as close to sacred objects as anything made by human hands could be, and recast them as cannons. The church protested. Peter did not stop. He rebuilt his army, trained it on European models, drilled it with a relentlessness that was just short of cruelty, and waited. The reckoning came at Poltava in the summer of 1709. Charles XII, campaigning deep into Ukraine in bitter winter cold, had made the series of decisions that brilliant commanders sometimes make when brilliance tips over into overreach. He had marched his army into the Russian interior in conditions that punished every weakness. By the time the two forces met near the town of Poltava, the Swedish army was diminished, underfed, poorly supplied, and exhausted in the particular way of men who've been fighting and moving and surviving on insufficient everything for too long. The Russian artillery opened in the early morning. The sound would have been immense. Dozens of cannons firing in coordinated volleys, the shock of it moving through the ground before it reached the ears, the smoke rising immediately to mix with the morning mist over the Ukrainian steppe. Charles, wounded days earlier, commanded from a litter carried by his soldiers. His army fought with the courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. It was not enough. In a few hours, the Swedish Empire effectively ended. Charles escaped with a small remnant of his forces into Ottoman territory, where he would spend years in exile trying to rebuild something that could not be rebuilt. The Baltic coastline, the access routes, the window Peter had been carving toward Europe, all of it opened at once, like a door swinging wide after years of pressing against it. Russia was no longer a large, strange country on the edge of Europe's awareness. It was a power, a presence, something that had to be calculated, negotiated with, taken seriously. Peter declared himself emperor, adopting the Roman title rather than the old Slavic one. The symbolism was deliberate. He was not merely continuing a tradition, he was beginning something new, and the city on the Neva, rising improbably from its swamp, would be the monument to that newness. By the time the most famous buildings took their final shape, the Winter Palace, the Peter and Paul Fortress with its gilded needle spire piercing the Baltic sky, the long embankments of stone that finally tamed the flooding river into something resembling permanence, St. Petersburg was, by any honest assessment, magnificent. Visitors who came expecting the rough-edged Byzantine sprawl of Moscow found instead a city of straight boulevards and baroque facades, of water and stone and ordered light, of an almost aggressive European elegance that seemed to have no right to exist in this climate, on this ground, at the edge of this particular wilderness. Peter ordered his nobility to be magnificent along with it. He issued decrees requiring the great families of Russia to relocate to St. Petersburg and to build homes there commensurate with their status. Not suggestions, decrees with consequences for non-compliance. The nobles who hated the cold, who hated being uprooted from their Moscow estates and their familiar networks of influence, who hated the perpetual damp and the floods and the sense of being perched on the edge of something unstable. They built their palaces anyway. They filled them with European art and European furniture and European fashions as Peter required, and they shivered inside their magnificence and called the city a golden cage, which it was. It was a cage, and it was golden, and Peter had built every bar of it himself. He died in the winter of 1725, and the manner of his death was so perfectly in keeping with everything he had been that it almost seems too fitting to be entirely true. He saw soldiers drowning in the freezing shallow waters of the Gulf of Finland after a boat ran aground, and he waded in to help pull them to safety. He was 52 years old. The cold water that same Baltic cold he had spent his reign either fighting or harnessing or building his city on the edge of, found the weakness in him that decades of impossible labour had created. He developed pneumonia and did not recover. He left behind a transformed empire, European capital, a military that had humbled Sweden, and a dynasty that now sat at the centre of continental power rather than its distant exotic edge. He also left behind no clear instruction for who should rule next. The throne of Russia passed through a succession of figures over the following decades, some capable, some catastrophic, most somewhere between, until history arrived, with its taste for irony, at the answer that Peter himself, with all his love of the unexpected, might have appreciated most. The next great ruler of Russia would not be a Russian. She would not be a man. She would arrive as a minor German princess of no particular importance, married off to a Romanov heir, expected to be decorative and obedient and quietly invisible. She would turn out to be none of those things. That transformation began not with a crown, but with a shock. When the 14-year-old Sophie stepped onto Russian soil in the deep winter of 1744, she wasn't met with warmth, but with a challenge. The Russian cold hit the young princess like a physical wall, a brutal, freezing introduction to a land that demanded everything from those who dared to master it. She was 14 years old. Her name was Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess from a minor German principality, which is to say she was a girl of good blood and very little else. No significant fortune, no powerful father, no particular reason for the Russian court to pay attention to her, except the one reason that mattered in the marriage markets of 18th century Europe. She was young, she was healthy, she was reportedly intelligent, and she was available. A Russian empress looking for a suitable wife for her nephew had sent word through diplomatic channels. Sophie's mother, a woman of ferocious social ambition dressed in the clothing of maternal concern, had accepted immediately. So here she was, standing, perhaps, at a frost-covered window, somewhere along the road to Moscow, watching a landscape that bore no resemblance to anything she had ever seen. The German principality she'd grown up in was small, comprehensible, human in scale. What was passing outside this window was something else entirely, a vastness that did not diminish as you travelled through it, but seemed instead to expand the further you went, as if Russia were not a place but a condition, infinite and indifferent, swallowing the road ahead and the road behind with equal appetite. The birch forest stretched to every horizon, white and skeletal in the winter light. The sky was enormous. The cold had a depth to it that a German winter, however unpleasant, had never suggested was possible. She was travelling with a small suitcase, her mother, and her wits. In the accounting of what she brought to Russia and what she would eventually make of it, the wits were by far the most important item. The court she was delivered into was the court of Empress Elizabeth, Peter the Great's surviving daughter, a woman of enormous appetites and genuine political shrewdness, who had herself seized power in a coup 2 years earlier, and who presided over a glittering, chaotic court that was part European salon and part Byzantine labyrinth, where the correct gesture at the correct moment could elevate a career or end it. Sophie watched everything. She said little. She began almost immediately to learn Russian. This was not expected of her. Foreign brides were not typically expected to master the language of their adopted country, any more than decorative objects are expected to have opinions about the rooms they are placed in. Sophie learned it anyway, rising before dawn to study with tutors, reportedly catching a serious chill because she practiced by an open window in the cold rather than disturb the household with lamplight. Whether or not the detail is precisely true, it captures something real about the girl. She had decided what she was doing, and she was doing it completely. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy. She took a Russian name, Ekaterina, which would become Catherine to the Western world that would eventually be watching her very closely. She performed her new faith with a sincerity that confused and impressed the courtiers who expected to see the mechanical compliance of a foreign girl going through required motions. She knelt on the cold stone floors of the Orthodox churches for hours. She learned the liturgy. She was becoming Russian with a thoroughness that the Russians themselves could not entirely account for and could not entirely resist. Then she met her husband, and the situation became considerably more complicated. Peter Fedorovich, Peter III as he would become, was 17 when they married, physically unprepossessing, emotionally volatile and almost aggressively uninterested in the country he was being prepared to rule. He was German by upbringing, if not entirely by birth, and unlike his wife, he had made no effort to conceal his contempt for Russian culture, Russian religion, or Russian anything. He collected Prussian military uniforms with the focused passion that other men direct toward things of genuine value. He played with toy soldiers, literally toy soldiers arranged in formations across the floors of his rooms, into his adulthood. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia with a fervor that exceeded what most people feel for actual deities, and he expressed this admiration at every possible opportunity to a Russian court that found it bewildering, then grating, then quietly alarming. He and Catherine despised each other, though the form of their mutual loathing evolved over the years from the bewildered disappointment of two young strangers badly matched into something colder and more considered. Peter mocked her openly at court functions. He took mistresses without the minimal discretion that etiquette required. He told people, in terms that circulated quickly through the network of court gossip, that he intended to divorce her once he became Tsar and replace her with someone more to his taste. Catherine, for her part, wrote in her memoirs with a calm precision that is more devastating than any outburst could have been, cataloguing his inadequacies and her own determination to survive them. She read, "This is perhaps the single most important thing to understand about Catherine in these years of a wretched marriage in a foreign court." She read with an omnivorous intensity that was practically a form of self-rescue. She worked through Voltaire and Montesquieu and Bayle, through the great texts of the Enlightenment that were circulating through educated European minds like fresh air through rooms that is enclosed too long. She was forming herself, quietly and deliberately, in the long stretches of time that her husband's indifference afforded her. She was building, book by book and conversation by conversation, the mind that would one day govern an empire. She was also, in these years, building alliances, the Russian Imperial Guard, those regiments of elite soldiers whose political significance Peter the Great had understood, and whose loyalty or hostility had already decided more than one succession, had opinions about the foreign nephew who insulted Russia and played with toy soldiers, and those opinions were not favourable. Catherine cultivated the guard officers carefully, with the particular social intelligence of a person who has learned from childhood to make powerful friends without appearing to want anything from them. She was ready when the moment came. She had been ready for years. Empress Elizabeth died in January of 1762. Peter III took the throne and proceeded in the following months to provide Catherine and her allies with more justification for removing him than any of them could reasonably have hoped for. He withdrew Russian forces from the 7 Years' War at the moment when Russia held a winning position. a decision that saved Prussia from potential destruction and made Frederick the Great so grateful he could barely contain himself, which did not escape the notice of Russian military officers who had watched their men die for that winning position. He insulted the Orthodox Church loudly and specifically, announcing plans to reform it along Lutheran lines. He appeared at official functions in Prussian uniform. He seemed to nearly everyone watching to be actively trying to make himself impossible to defend. On the morning of July 9th, 1762, Catherine acted. She rose before dawn, dressed in the dark green uniform of the Preobrazhensky Guard Regiment, the highest prestige regiment in the Russian military, and rode out of Peterhof on a white horse towards St. Petersburg with 14,000 soldiers at her back. The image is so theatrically perfect that it almost strains credulity. A 33-year-old German woman, her dark hair pinned under a military hat, astride a white horse in the grey northern morning, leading an army to take a throne that had never been meant for her. But history occasionally permits the theatrical image that tells the truth exactly. The coup was bloodless. Peter, confronted with the reality of what had happened, abdicated in terms that Catherine herself described as remarkably calm. The letter of a man who perhaps had always, on some level, expected to lose. He was taken into custody and moved to a country estate, where he died 8 days later, under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The official cause was hemorrhoidal colic. The actual cause was almost certainly human intervention, though whether Catherine ordered it, permitted it, or simply failed to prevent it has been debated ever since. She expressed the appropriate sorrow. She did not reverse course. She was Empress of Russia. She would reign for 34 years. The court she presided over became something that Peter the Great's grand ambition had gestured toward without quite achieving, a genuine centre of European intellectual and cultural life. She wrote letters to Voltaire that the old philosopher cherished, responding with a warmth and wit that made clear the exchange was not merely ceremonial flattery. She invited Diderot to St. Petersburg and talked with him for hours each day, listening to his ideas about governance and enlightenment with an attention that he found almost overwhelming. She bought great European art collections wholesale when their owners needed cash, accumulating thousands of paintings that she housed in a series of rooms adjoining the Winter Palace, rooms that would eventually become the Hermitage Museum, one of the greatest collections of art in human history. She wrote legislation. She corresponded with every significant thinker of the age. She was, in the language of the time, the philosopher on the throne. The living argument that enlightened monarchy was not a contradiction in terms, but a genuine possibility. She also crushed the Pugachev rebellion with a ferocity that her philosopher friends in Paris found diplomatically difficult to discuss. Yemelyan Pugachev, a Cossack leader who claimed to be the miraculously survived Peter III and gathered an enormous following of serfs and Cossacks and dispossessed peoples across the Volga region, had threatened the very foundations of the social order that Catherine's reign rested on. She understood that an enlightened empress who lost control of her empire was neither enlightened nor an empress. The rebellion was suppressed. Pugachev was taken to Moscow in an iron cage and publicly executed. The letters to Voltaire continued. She expanded Russia's territory with a consistency of purpose that made her neighbours deeply nervous. The Crimean Khanate was absorbed, giving Russia its long-desired access to the warm waters of the Black Sea, Vels, access that Peter the Great had gestured toward and Catherine completed. Poland was partitioned 3 times during her reign, in collaboration with Prussia and Austria, until the Polish state was distributed between its neighbours and ceased to exist on any map. Catherine's Russia, by the time of her death in 1796, was larger than it had been at any previous point in its history, and it was larger not through accident or inheritance, but through the sustained application of strategic intelligence over 3.5 decades. She died at 67 in the autumn from a stroke. She'd been vigorous until the very end, still governing, still corresponding, still fully in command of a mind that had been from the beginning her most formidable possession. A minor German princess with a small suitcase had become the most powerful woman in the world, and she had done it by deciding, at 14, in a carriage moving through a Russian winter, that this frozen and infinite country was going to be hers. The court that mourned her was already anxious, though not about the succession. The anxiety had a different source, moving through diplomatic dispatches and private conversations with the particular quality of a dread that has not yet taken full shape. Something was happening in Western Europe, something that Voltaire and Diderot's great project of enlightenment had set in motion without quite intending the specific result. A revolution in France had consumed its own architects, and from the resulting chaos, with the inexorable logic of certain historical moments, a single figure was ascending. He was short. He is from an island most Europeans could barely locate on a map. He had a general's eye for ground and a gambler's appetite for risk and an ambition that made the ambitions of Catherine herself look measured and contained. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was not finished with Europe yet. Not even close. By the summer of 1812, that "not finished" had evolved into an existential threat. The western bank of the Niemen River was no longer just a border. It was a stage for the largest military instrument the world had ever seen. What stood there on the 24th of June defies easy description, but its intent was unmistakable. The French word for it, the word Napoleon's officers used when they looked east from that riverbank, was simply La Grande Armée, the Great Army. And even that phrase, grand as it is, fails to capture the physical reality of what had assembled on the border of Russia that summer morning. 680,000 men, drawn from every corner of Napoleon's empire and every nation that orbited it, French and Polish and Italian and German and Dutch and Spanish and Croatian and Portuguese, a continent's worth of soldiers funneled into a single, enormous, westward-facing instrument of conquest. Their supply wagons stretched back beyond the horizon. Their campfires, the night before the crossing, had turned the western sky amber for miles in every direction. The Niemen River, as the first columns began crossing on hastily constructed pontoon bridges, trembled slightly with the weight of their passage. Napoleon stood at the edge of the bank and looked east into Russia, and everything in his posture and his history suggested a man who did not expect to be standing in this same spot again, looking west, in defeat. He was 42 years old. He had beaten Austria and Prussia and the combined armies of Europe. He had redrawn the map of the continent as casually as a man rearranges furniture. Russia's Tsar Alexander I had been his ally, then his rival, and now, because Russia had quietly abandoned the trade embargo against Britain that Napoleon required to strangle his last significant enemy, had become his problem. The solution, as Napoleon calculated it, was a rapid and decisive campaign. March in, fight the main Russian army in one or two large engagements somewhere near the border, destroy it, accept Alexander's surrender, dictate terms, and march home before the summer was out. It was a reasonable plan. It had worked everywhere else. Russia, as Napoleon was about to discover, was not everywhere else. The Russian army retreated. This was not cowardice, though Napoleon initially interpreted it as such. This was strategy. Specifically the strategy of a general named Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, who understood something about his own situation with uncomfortable clarity. The Russian army could not defeat Napoleon in a straight fight. Not yet. Not here. Not with the Grande Armée at full strength and full morale. Every battle fought and lost near the border would be one step closer to total defeat. Every mile Napoleon advanced into Russia was 1 mile further from his supply lines, 1 mile deeper into a country that had no intention of making his presence comfortable. So they retreated, and as they retreated, they burned. The scorched earth policy was not a pleasant strategy to execute or to observe. Russian soldiers and Russian peasants, the same people whose homes and fields and wells these were, torched their own villages as they pulled back. Granaries that had been filling since spring went up in smoke. Livestock that could not be driven east quickly enough were killed rather than left for French foragers. Wells were poisoned with dead animals or simply filled with debris until they were useless. The towns that Napoleon's advance guard rode into, expecting to find food and shelter, and at minimum the quiet satisfaction of occupation, found instead charred foundations and the smell of recent burning, and a silence that was somehow worse than resistance. Napoleon's army had not brought sufficient supplies for a long campaign, because a long campaign had not been anticipated. Now, moving through a landscape that had been systematically stripped of everything an army needs to keep moving — food, fodder for horses, shelter, drinkable water — the Grande Armée began, almost imperceptibly at first, to deteriorate. Men who had marched confidently across the Niemen in June were marching hungry in July. The horses, without adequate fodder, began to weaken and die. The roads, Russian roads, which were not roads so much as dirt tracks that summer heat turned to dust and autumn rain would turn to something very different, began to chew at boots and wheels alike. Napoleon pressed forward because stopping was not in his vocabulary, and because somewhere ahead surely the Russians would turn and fight and give him the battle he needed to end this. They gave him Borodino. On the 7th of September 1812, on a rolling field of farmland near the village of that name, roughly 70 miles west of Moscow, the two armies finally met in the engagement that Napoleon had been seeking for 2.5 months. What followed was not the clean, decisive victory his campaigns usually produced. What followed was something that both sides, in private moments of honesty, could only describe as a slaughter. The Russian commander was Mikhail Kutuzov, old, enormously fat, missing an eye from a wound sustained in an earlier war, and possessed of a strategic intelligence that expressed itself not in brilliance, but in solidity, in a particular willingness to absorb punishment without breaking. He had placed his army behind earthwork fortifications called flèches and redoubts, concentrating his artillery and accepting that what was coming would be terrible. The Russian soldiers who waited behind those earthworks on the morning of September the 7th understood, in the way that soldiers understand these things, that the day would cost them enormously. They waited anyway. The French artillery opened before dawn. The Russian artillery answered, more than 1,000 cannons firing simultaneously, and that number deserves a moment of silence, because no notation does justice to what 1,000 cannons sound like, to the way that volume stops being something you hear and becomes something you feel in your chest wall and your teeth, to the smoke that accumulated in minutes into a fog that turned the entire battlefield grey and orange and made command and coordination nearly impossible for anyone trying to see what was happening more than 100 yards away. Men moved through that smoke by memory and by following the sounds of voices they recognized, fighting for earthwork positions that changed hands multiple times in the same morning and then changed hands again in the afternoon. By the time darkness stopped the fighting, somewhere between 70 and 80,000 men were dead or wounded in a single day, on a field that measured a few miles across. Kutuzov had held his ground, which allowed both sides to claim something, and Napoleon held the battlefield at the end, which allowed him to claim something more. But the Russian army had not been destroyed, which was the only outcome that would have mattered. Kutuzov withdrew east in good order, still intact, still capable. Napoleon moved toward Moscow, and then Kutuzov made the decision that shocked everyone, that his own officers could barely bring themselves to accept, that violated every military and emotional instinct about what a city means to the people who live in it, and the army that is supposed to defend it. He decided not to defend Moscow. He decided that the city was less valuable than the army, and that spending the army to save the city was the wrong arithmetic. He led his forces south and east, away from Moscow, leaving the ancient capital open. Napoleon entered Moscow on the 14th of September, 1812. He rode in expecting what conquerors usually receive upon entering a great city. Crowds, however sullen, however hostile, and somewhere in the formal proceedings of defeat, representatives of the Tsar arriving to discuss terms of surrender. He found neither. Moscow was empty. The population had evacuated. The streets were silent in the particular eerie way that streets are silent when they are supposed to be full, a silence that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before something terrible. The fire began that night. Whether it was deliberate order, spontaneous action, or some combination of both has been argued ever since. What is certain is that Moscow burned. It burned for 6 days. The wooden buildings that made up the majority of the city's structures, churches and merchant houses, and the dense residential neighborhoods that had accumulated over centuries, caught and spread the fire with horrifying efficiency. Napoleon, watching from the Kremlin as the city around him turned to a furnace, reportedly stood at the window for hours without speaking. The gold of the cathedral domes, as the heat reached them, didn't melt in any dramatic sense, but the fire that surrounded them turned the sky above the city a red that was visible for 20 miles in every direction. The smell of burning Moscow reached the Russian army's camp to the south, and the soldiers who smelled it understood that their country had decided to consume itself rather than surrender. Napoleon waited in the ruins for 5 weeks. He waited for a letter from Alexander, a letter offering terms, requesting negotiations, acknowledging the reality of occupation. The letter did not come. Alexander, in St. Petersburg, had made his own decision. He would not negotiate. Not from Moscow, not from the ashes of Moscow, not from anywhere. Napoleon could wait in his burned city until the weather made the decision for both of them. The weather did. The first snow fell in October. It fell on the Grand Armée as it turned west out of Moscow. 680,000 men who had crossed the Niemen in June, now reduced by battle and disease and desertion, and the ceaseless attrition of a campaign that had gone wrong in every direction, reduced to something less than 100,000 effective soldiers, beginning the longest and coldest walk of their lives. The Russian winter that descended on the retreat was the winter that Russian winters aspire to be. The temperature dropped below -20, then below -30. Men who had stripped their heavy greatcoats in the summer heat had not recovered them. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find. Curtains pulled from the ruins of burned houses, church vestments looted from abandoned villages, women's shawls, carpets, pieces of upholstery, anything that might slow the cold's entry. Horses died by the thousands when the temperature dropped far enough that their shoes, unsuited to ice, could no longer keep them upright on the frozen roads. When the horses died, the artillery they had been pulling was abandoned. When the artillery was abandoned, any remaining sense of military formation went with it. The Cossack cavalry understood what was happening and acted accordingly. They did not engage the French in pitched battle. There was no need for that kind of risk. They rode in from the flanks and the rear, hit the struggling columns where they were weakest, took what they wanted and disappeared back into the winter landscape before any organized response was possible. For the men in those columns, the Cossack raids were one more element of a nightmare that seemed to have no flaw. Every day worse than the day before, the cold deeper, the food scarcer, the distance to the western border still enormous. Of the nearly 700,000 men who had crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 crossed back out. Napoleon had met the one enemy his genius could not outmaneuver. Not Alexander, not Kutuzov, not the Russian army. The land itself, the distance, the cold, the willingness of Russia to absorb and absorb and absorb until the thing pressing against it simply ran out. The saviour of Europe had come from the east, from General Winter, from the same merciless geography that had shaped every Romanov who'd ever tried to govern it. Russian soldiers marched west through the wreckage of Napoleon's retreat, chasing the remnants of the Grande Armée all the way to Paris. They walked through the capitals of Europe. They sat in the cafes of France. They read pamphlets. They had conversations that could not have happened in Russia, about ideas that were not permitted in Russia, about constitutions and the rights of ordinary men and the limits of imperial power, about what a government might owe the people it governed rather than the other way around. They brought those conversations home in their heads, carried them back across the border like contraband, and sat with them through the long Russian winters, turning them over in the firelight. The external fire was out. Something was lighting inside. And in the years to come, a new Tsar would try to answer the question those returning soldiers were beginning to ask. A Tsar who would make a choice so radical, so unprecedented, that history would give him a name that no Russian ruler had ever carried before. They would call him the Liberator, and they would kill him for it. But that liberation wasn't born from a moment of triumph. It was forged in the fire of a devastating defeat. Before Alexander II could become the hero of the masses, the Russian Empire had to be shattered by a brutal awakening. It was a particular kind of humiliation, one that forced the Romanovs to confront the gap between their imperial myths and the stark technological reality of a changing world. Russia experienced that humiliation in the Crimea between 1853 and 1856, and it was the kind that leaves a mark. The war itself, on paper, should not have been a catastrophe. Russia was fighting on its own territory, defending its own Black Sea coastline against British and French expeditionary forces that had travelled thousands of miles to get there. The mathematics of home advantage and proximity to supply lines should have favoured the defenders. Instead, what the Crimean War revealed to the Russian High Command and to the watching world simultaneously was that the empire that had consumed Napoleon's Grande Armée was operating with the military infrastructure of a previous century. Russian soldiers marched to the front on foot because Russia had almost no railways. Russian commanders communicated by courier because Russia had almost no telegraph lines. Russian rifles were smooth-bore muskets of the kind that Western armies had replaced a generation earlier with rifled barrels that were accurate at twice the range. The British and French forces that landed in Crimea were, in the narrow but decisive sense of technological military capacity, fighting men from the future against men from the past. Russia lost. Badly enough that the loss could not be reframed as anything other than what it was. The Tsar who inherited this humiliation, who sat with the full weight of it settling onto his shoulders in the winter of 1855, when his father Nicholas I died and the throne passed to him, was Alexander II. He was 36 years old, tall, bearded, possessed, of a genuine emotional intelligence that his father had entirely lacked, and capable of a quality that is rarer in autocrats than it should be. He could look at a situation clearly and accept what he was seeing, even when what he was seeing was unwelcome. What he was seeing was this. Russia's backwardness was not incidental to its social structure. It was a product of it. The serfdom that bound 23 million Russian peasants to the land and to the nobles who owned that land, a system that was, in its practical operations, slavery dressed in different language, was not simply a moral catastrophe. It was an economic and military catastrophe. Serfs had no incentive to innovate, no ability to relocate to where labor was needed, no stake in the prosperity of the country they were legally attached to. An empire that ran on serf labor was an empire that could not industrialize, could not build railways quickly enough, could not produce the surplus capital that modern military power required. The Crimea had shown what that meant in blood and territorial humiliation. Alexander said it plainly, in a speech to the Moscow nobility that his audience received with the discomfort of people being told something they already know but have successfully avoided hearing. It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for it to abolish itself from below. He began drafting the legislation that would change Russia more profoundly than anything since Peter the Great had shaved his nobles' beards. On the 19th of February 1861, Alexander II signed the Emancipation Reform. 23 million people, human beings who had been, in the eyes of Russian law and the operations of Russian agriculture, property, were declared free. Try to hold the scale of that number for a moment. 23 million. A population larger than many European countries, a population that had no legal personhood, that could be bought and sold and gambled away and worked to death, without meaningful legal consequence that had existed within living memory as items in a transaction rather than parties to one. They were free. The decree was read in churches across Russia on a Sunday morning, the priests delivering the words from their pulpits while the peasants stood and listened and tried to understand what they were hearing. What they heard in the villages was complicated. The freedom was real, but its architecture was disorienting. The serfs were liberated from their masters, yes, but the land they had been farming, the land their families had worked for generations, was not simply given to them. They were required to purchase it, through redemption payments spread over decades from the nobles who had owned it. They were free, but they were free with debt attached, free in a system that had not yet built the infrastructure, legal, financial, educational, that freedom requires to mean something in daily life. The village celebrations that broke out across Russia when the decree was announced mixed within weeks with a more complicated feeling. The particular confusion of people who have been promised a new world and are not sure the world they have actually received is quite the same thing. The nobility experienced a different confusion, composed largely of fury. The estate owners who had built their entire economic existence around the labour of serfs, who had borrowed against it, planned around it, lived on it for generations. found themselves suddenly in possession of land they could not farm as cheaply as before, and redemption payments from peasants that arrived irregularly, if at all. The liberation of the serfs did not destroy the Russian nobility, but it cracked the foundation of their world, and the resentment that followed was structural rather than personal, the resentment of a class that felt history had committed a theft. Alexander did not stop with the serfs. He reformed the judiciary, creating independent courts and trial by jury in a country that had previously known neither. He reformed local government, creating elected assemblies called zemstvos that gave ordinary Russians a degree of participation in local affairs. He relaxed censorship. He opened the universities. He was building, step by careful step, towards something that Russia had never had: a political system in which something other than the Tsar's will could be heard and occasionally acted upon. The young men and women who came out of those newly opened universities did not, for the most part, respond to these reforms with gratitude. They responded with impatience, which is what happens when a closed room is suddenly given a window. The window reveals that the room is still a room, and the people inside it now know what the outside looks like and want the door instead. They called themselves nihilists at first, a word they took from a novel, Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, and wore as a kind of badge. They believed in nothing that the existing order believed in, not the Tsar, not the church, not the system of property and privilege that organized Russian society. They believed in science and materialism, and the proposition that the existing world needed to be cleared away before anything genuinely new could be built. They gathered in apartments and basements. These young people, many of them from good families, educated, articulate, burning with the particular energy of people who've understood something they cannot unfeel. And they argued about what it meant to want a new world badly enough. Some of them argued their way to a conclusion that had a simple and terrible logic. If the system could not be reformed, it could be destroyed. If the Tsar was the keystone of the system, then the Tsar was the target. A group called Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will, made it their explicit organizational purpose to kill Alexander II. They were persistent, they were creative, and they were very nearly successful several times before they were finally successful once. In 1879, they attempted to blow up the imperial train. The explosion hit the wrong train, a logistical failure, not a moral hesitation. In February of 1880, a carpenter named Stepan Kalturin, who'd obtained a position in the Winter Palace itself, detonated a charge of dynamite beneath the palace dining room while Alexander was expected to be at dinner. The Tsar was delayed. 11 soldiers of the palace guard were killed instead. The explosion blew through the floor of the dining room and left a crater in the room below, and Alexander walked through the wreckage and understood, with a clarity that required no elaboration, that his enemies had managed to plant a bomb inside his own home. He became, in these years, something close to a prisoner of the security arrangements required to keep him alive. Routes varied, schedules changed. The third section of the secret police worked without rest. Armed guards accompanied every movement, and through all of it, the failed bombs and the failed shootings and the elaborate, exhausting choreography of survival, Alexander continued to work on the document that he believed was Russia's best path forward. A consultative commission, not a full parliament, not constitution in the Western sense, but a formal mechanism by which elected representatives could bring the concerns of the Russian people into the legislative process. A beginning, a direction, a signal that the Romanov dynasty could was learning, to share the room it had occupied alone for 2.5 centuries. He was, by early 1881, very close to signing it, The morning of the 13th of March was a Sunday. Alexander had attended a military review at the Mikhailovsky Manege and was returning by carriage along the Catherine Canal embankment, a route his security team had specified. There were Cossack escorts and plainclothes police. The precautions were substantial. The first bomb was thrown at the carriage by a young man named Nikolai Rysakov. It exploded beneath the carriage, killing 2 Cossacks and wounding several bystanders. The carriage itself was damaged but did not collapse. Alexander was unhurt. He got out. This is the moment that history has turned over and examined from every angle in the years since, trying to understand it. His security detail urged him to get into another carriage immediately, to move, to not stand in the open street. Alexander refused. He walked to the wounded men on the ground. He spoke to Rysakov, who had been seized by the crowd. He asked if he was hurt. A witness reported that he seemed, in that moment, more concerned with the bodies of his guards than with his own survival. A quality that reads, depending on your interpretation, as courage or as the particular fatalism of a man who has spent years knowing that his death was being actively planned and has reached some private accommodation with that knowledge. The second bomb was thrown by Ignacy Hryniewiecki, who had been waiting among the gathered crowd. It landed at the Tsar's feet. The explosion shattered both his legs below the knee. It tore open his abdomen. Hryniewiecki himself was mortally wounded by the same blast. Alexander was lifted from the bloody snow, his own blood and the blood of others mixing on the stones of the Catherine Canal embankment, and carried back to the Winter Palace in a sleigh that left a trail of red across the white streets of St. Petersburg. He died that afternoon. He was 62 years old. He'd spent 26 years trying to modernize Russia from above, moving at the speed that autocratic systems permit, which is always slower than the speed that the people below them are demanding. The document was on his desk, unsigned. In the hours and days after the assassination, as the shock moved through the court and through the city and through the empire, there was a moment, a genuine historical hinge, when the direction Russia would take was not yet determined. The reforms could have continued. The consultative commission could have been signed by the new Tsar, Alexander III, as a tribute to his father and a continuation of his work. Some in the court argued for exactly that. Alexander III signed nothing of the kind. He had watched his father's liberalism produce a bomb at his father's feet, and he had drawn the only conclusion that grief and fear reliably produce in men who have the power to act on them. He reversed the reforms where he could. He intensified the secret police. He governed with the kind of rigid, frightened autocracy that mistakes hardness for strength and controls everything except the things that cannot ultimately be controlled. The window that Alexander II had spent his life trying to open did not merely close, it was locked. The key was thrown away. And across Russia, in the apartments and basements where young people had once argued about nihilism and reform, a different conversation was beginning, harder, colder, with less interest in philosophy and considerably more interest in practical questions about power and how it might be taken rather than given. The clock had started. Nobody knew yet how much time was left or what the end would look like, but somewhere in a provincial city, in a family that was about to be torn apart by the same revolutionary logic that had killed the Liberator, a boy was growing up with his father's name on an execution list. His name was Vladimir, and the world would know him by another name entirely. But first, the dynasty had one more chapter to write, one more Tsar to place on the throne. A gentle man, a loving father, a weak ruler, and a court that had already admitted something dark through its back door. The monk was coming. But that monk was still a shadow in the distance. First, the crown had to fall onto the head of a man who was never built to carry its weight. The arrival of the mysterious stranger would only be possible because of the cracks that were already forming in the heart of the new Tsar. We see those cracks most clearly not in an official decree, but in the private words of a terrified young man. There is a diary entry that Nicholas II wrote on the day his father died, in October of 1894, that historians return to again and again because it contains, in 2 sentences, everything you need to understand about the tragedy that followed. He wrote it after learning that the throne of the largest empire on earth had just passed to him, and what he wrote was not resolve or ambition, or even grief cleanly expressed. He turned to a cousin standing nearby and said through tears, "What is going to happen to me, to all of Russia? I'm not ready to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one." He was 26 years old. He was gentle, genuinely kind, devoted to his family with a warmth that everyone who knew him privately attested to. He loved photography and long walks and playing with his dogs and the particular quiet happiness of a man who has found the life he wants and wants nothing beyond it. He was, by every account that penetrates the formal portraiture of the period, a good man in the specific and limited sense that goodness in private life is a real quality. Patient, affectionate, loyal, without cruelty. He was also, by the judgment of history and by his own terrified admission, entirely unsuited to the role that had just swallowed him whole. The problem was not intelligence exactly. Nicholas was not stupid. The problem was will, the particular quality that autocracy requires above all others. The capacity to look at a decision that will hurt people and make it anyway. To hold a position under pressure, to impose your vision on a world that is pushing back. His father, Alexander III, has been a wall. Nicholas was a door that opened inward whenever anything pressed against it from outside. He made decisions and unmade them. He listened to the last person who had spoken to him, and then listened equally to the next. He was, in the language of the time, a weak Tsar, and in a system where the Tsar's personal strength was the only thing holding the structure together, weakness at the center was not a personality flaw. It was a structural failure. His coronation in May of 1896 was meant to be a celebration, a declaration to Russia and to the watching world that the Romanov dynasty was entering a new era with confidence and continuity. What it became instead was an omen so dark, so precisely calibrated to the reign that followed, that it reads now like something a novelist would invent and an editor would flag as too obvious. On the Kudinka field outside Moscow, the Coronation festivities included a public celebration at which free gifts would be distributed, commemorative enamel cups, small packages of food, the kind of symbolic gesture that Russian Tsars made to demonstrate their benevolence toward ordinary people. Word spread through Moscow and the surrounding countryside that the cups were worth having, that there might not be enough for everyone, and on the morning of the distribution, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people gathered on a field that was, beneath its surface, riddled with ditches and gullies from previous military exercises, hazards that the crowd organizers either did not know about or did not adequately account for. When the distribution began and the crowd surged forward, those hidden ditches became death traps. People fell and were not able to get up because there was no space to get up, because the press of bodies from behind continued regardless of what was happening in front. The crushing lasted minutes. By the time it was over, more than 1,300 people were dead and hundreds more were injured, their bodies left on a field littered with the commemorative cups they had come to collect. Nicholas was told. He expressed grief, which appears to have been genuine, and then, That evening, he attended a ball at the French embassy because his advisors told him that cancelling would cause a diplomatic incident, and Nicholas, who could never hold a position when someone pushed against it, went. He danced. He smiled at the appropriate moments. He performed the role of a czar at a party while 1,300 of his subjects lay dead in the field outside the city. This is not a simple moment to judge. The advisors who told him to attend were not wrong about the diplomatic calculus. The decision had a defensible logic inside the closed world of court protocol, but the Russian people were not inside that closed world, and what they saw, or rather, what they heard, because the news travelled fast and the interpretation travelled with it, was a Tsar who had danced on the night of the Kodinka disaster. The word that attached to Nicholas in those early months, the word that would never entirely detach itself, was disconnected. He did not feel what his people felt, or if he felt it, he did not know how to show it in the ways that mattered. The reign that followed was a long education in humiliation, and the lessons arrived faster than anyone could absorb them. The Russo-Japanese War began in 1904, initiated by Russia's expansion into Manchuria and Korea, territories that Japan considered within its own sphere of influence and was prepared to fight for. The court in St. Petersburg did not take Japan seriously as a military opponent. The assumption, stated openly in some quarters and simply presumed in others, was that a European great power did not lose wars to an Asian nation, that the hierarchy of the world's military capabilities was self-evident and stable. This assumption was about to receive one of the most comprehensive corrections in the history of modern warfare. The Japanese army outfought Russian forces in Manchuria with a consistency that became, over months of dispatches arriving in St. Petersburg, increasingly impossible to explain away. The fall of Port Arthur, a Russian naval base in Manchuria that had been besieged for months and was supposed to be impregnable, sent a shock through the empire. And then came Tsushima. In May of 1905, the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed 17,000 miles around the world to relieve the Pacific Squadron, a journey of almost incomprehensible logistical audacity, met the Japanese fleet in the Tsushima Strait and was annihilated in less than 2 days. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the battle, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and 6 escaped. It was not a defeat, it was an erasure. The Russian Navy, which had been a source of national pride since the days of Peter the Great, simply ceased to exist as a meaningful force in the Pacific. The war ended in humiliating peace, brokered by Theodore Roosevelt in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in terms that gave Japan everything it had fought for. For the Russian people, already strained by years of war, by the casualties and the cost and the cognitive dissonance of an empire that had beaten Napoleon, losing to a nation it had barely considered a rival, the humiliation was a kind of last straw. The straw fell on a Sunday in January 1905 in St. Petersburg. A priest named Georgy Gapon led a procession of workers through the winter streets toward the Winter Palace, a crowd that grew as it moved, swelling to somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people, carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar alongside their petitions. The petitions asked for reasonable things: an 8-hour workday, better wages, the end of the war, a representative assembly. The tone of what they carried and what they were asking communicated, unmistakably, not revolutionary intent, but the particular kind of hopeful supplication that people direct toward authority they still believe might hear them. They were coming to their little father. They were coming as his children to ask for his help. The soldiers who had been positioned around the palace received the crowd differently. The exact orders, the precise chain of command, the specific moment of decision, these have been disputed ever since. What is not disputed is the outcome. The soldiers opened fire on the icons and the portraits and the petitions and the people carrying them. The snow of the palace square turned red, and the screaming replaced the hymns the crowd had been singing, and the image that burned itself into Russian memory that day was not a Tsar's benevolence, but a Tsar's guns pointed at his own people. Nicholas was not at the Winter Palace that Sunday. He was at a different residence outside the city, and the orders to fire had not come directly from him, and these facts were true and also entirely irrelevant to the meaning the day acquired. He was the Tsar. The soldiers were his soldiers. The people had come to him. The name that attached to him after Bloody Sunday, Nicholas the Bloody, was not a legal judgment. It was a feeling. And feelings of that kind, once formed in the hearts of millions of people, do not dissolve when you present them with mitigating facts. The little father had died on the snow of Palace Square, and something harder and colder had taken his place in the Russian imagination. In the quieter rooms of the Alexander Palace, away from the politics and the wars and the disasters that seemed to follow his reign like weather, Nicholas had a happiness that was real and that he clung to with everything he had. His wife Alexandra and his 5 children, 4 daughters, and then, in 1904, the long-awaited son, the Tsarevich Alexei, an heir, a future, the continuation of everything the dynasty meant and had always meant. The joy lasted until the first bleeding episode, and then the discovery behind it, the secret that would be kept from the Russian people, shared with almost no one at court, carried by his parents in private terror through every public appearance and state function, and political crisis that followed. Alexei had haemophilia. In 1904, without the treatments that later medicine would develop, haemophilia in a child meant that any wound, any bruise, any internal bleeding could spiral into an episode of agony that went on for days and might not stop. The Tsar's heir, the future of the Romanov dynasty, was a child who could bleed to death from a fall in the garden. Alexandra searched everywhere. She prayed with a ferocity that moved past devotion into desperation. And eventually, through the connections of aristocratic networks that has been following his reputation across Russia, there arrived in St. Petersburg a Siberian peasant with unwashed hair and a long tangled beard and a pair of eyes that people who met him struggled to describe without reaching for words like piercing or hypnotic or frightening. He sat beside the boy's bed. He spoke softly. And somehow, in ways that have never been fully explained to the satisfaction of either science or faith, the bleeding slowed. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and the empire, crumbling from every direction at once, was about to let him in. Entering that palace wasn't just a physical act for the Siberian peasant, it was a spiritual invasion. He didn't find a fortress of imperial power, but a sanctuary of desperate sorrow. Behind the closed doors of the Alexander Palace, the atmosphere had long since soured, turning into a heavy, suffocating mix of incense and anxiety. Not the triumphant incense of a high Orthodox service, that rich, ceremonial cloud that rises in the great cathedrals of Russia and carries with it the accumulated weight of centuries of devotion. This was something quieter and more desperate. The incense of private prayer, of a woman on her knees in a room with the curtains drawn, asking God the same question she had been asking for years without receiving an answer she could live with. Alexandra Fyodorovna, Empress of all Russia, wife of the Tsar, mother of 5, was by the first decade of the 20th century a woman who'd been hollowed out by a grief she could not share with anyone outside the innermost circle of her family, because the grief itself was a state secret. Her son was dying by degrees, not quickly, not in a single dramatic crisis, but in the slow and recurring way of a child with haemophilia, a bruise that became a swelling that became an internal bleed, a bleed that became days of screaming pain that the best physicians in Russia could treat only by standing helplessly at the bedside and waiting for the episode to exhaust itself. The doctors were excellent men. They knew everything that medicine in 1910 knew about haemophilia, which was essentially that the blood did not clot properly and that there was nothing to be done about it. They told Alexandra this with professional precision and genuine compassion, and it helped her not at all. She'd grown brittle in these years, in the way that people grow brittle when they are under continuous, unrelenting pressure that no one around them can fully see. She withdrew from court life, from the social performances that an empress was expected to deliver with apparent effortlessness. She developed the reputation, unfair in its simplicity but not entirely invented, of being cold, aloof, hostile to the Russia she'd married into. What she actually was, underneath the marble exterior that strangers encountered, was a mother in a state of sustained private terror, and the combination of that terror and the isolation she had wrapped around it had made her, by the time Rasputin arrived, ready to believe in almost anything that offered a possibility of relief. Grigory Yefimovich. Rasputin came from the village of Pokrovskoye in western Siberia, and he brought the village with him in every sense that mattered. The unwashed hair, the beard that grew in directions that suggested it had never encountered a comb, the smell of a man who had travelled long distances on foot and was not troubled by what that left behind. The rough peasant clothes that looked in the gilded rooms of the Alexander Palace like a deliberate insult to everything around them. He was not handsome. He was not refined. He was not anything that the Russian court had a category for, except in the ancient category of the Stranic, the wandering holy man, the pilgrim, the figure who exists on the margins of the respectable world and is granted by that marginality a spiritual authority that the respectable world cannot produce from within itself. What people remembered, always and first, were his eyes. Grey in most descriptions, though some accounts say blue, and the disagreement itself suggests something, that the colour was less remarkable than the quality being a focused, unblinking attention that made the person receiving it feel simultaneously seen and uncertain. Princes and diplomats who had looked unflinchingly at powerful men their entire lives wrote in their diaries about the discomfort of meeting Rasputin's gaze. Something in it did not behave the way eyes were supposed to behave. Whether this was genuine hypnotic ability, extraordinary personal presence, or simply the projection of frightened and susceptible observers onto an unusual face has been argued ever since, and the argument cannot be resolved, which is part of what makes it endure. He was brought to the palace to sit with Alexei during bleeding episodes, and the bleeding stopped. This is the documented fact around which everything else orbits, and it is a fact that has never been satisfactorily explained. The theories are numerous. That Rasputin instructed the attendants to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which thins the blood and which was being administered in large quantities as a painkiller, not knowing its effect on a haemophiliac. This is the most clinically plausible explanation, and it may be true, and it does not feel like the whole story. That his calming presence reduced the boy's anxiety, and therefore reduced blood pressure and therefore slowed bleeding, this is physiologically coherent and emotionally credible. that something else was happening, something that resists the categories of either medicine or fraudulence. This is what Alexandra believed, and her belief was not the belief of a stupid woman. The crisis that sealed it came in the autumn of 1912, at the imperial hunting estate of Spala in Poland. Alexei, 8 years old, suffered an internal bleeding episode after a minor injury that grew over days into something genuinely life-threatening. The swelling in his abdomen was enormous. The pain was beyond what morphine adequately reached. The physicians issued a bulletin that essentially communicated, in the careful language of court announcements, that the child was dying. Last rites were administered. The family prepared. Alexandra sent a telegram to Rasputin, who was in Siberia. He sent one back. "The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." Within days, the bleeding began to resolve. The swelling receded. Alexei lived. The physicians had no explanation. Alexandra needed none. She had her explanation. It had a long beard and grey eyes, and it had come from the wilderness to save her son. And from that moment forward, her faith in Grigory, Rasputin, was not susceptible to argument, evidence, or the increasingly frantic protests of everyone around her. What Alexandra saw in her private rooms was a miracle worker and a man of God. What Russia saw was considerably different. The Rasputin who moved through the taverns and bathhouses of St. Petersburg, and he did move through them, freely and frequently, in ways that he made little effort to conceal, was a figure of public scandal on a scale that the court found increasingly difficult to manage. He drank heavily. He kept the company of women who were not his wife. He received petitioners who wanted access to imperial favour, and dispensed that access with the casual confidence of a man who knew exactly how much power his position at the palace afforded him. The mix of genuine religious charisma and entirely worldly appetite was not a hypocrisy he appeared to experience as uncomfortable. He seemed to believe, in the way of certain mystical traditions, that sin and sanctity were not opposites but companions, that the man who descended furthest into human darkness and returned was closer to God for the journey. The Russian public did not share this theology. The stories circulated, in newspapers, in pamphlets, in the whispered networks of court gossip that were worse than any printed scandal. And the stories grew with each retelling, as stories about powerful figures always do. Some of what was said was true, some was exaggerated, some was invented by enemies who needed a target. The aggregate effect was a Romanov dynasty that was, in the public imagination, being run from the bedroom of a dissolute peasant mystic. Nicholas knew. He received the reports, read them, expressed discomfort, and ultimately deferred to Alexandra every time the question of removing Rasputin arose, because Alexandra's belief was not something he could argue with, and because Alexei's bleeding episodes were not something he could discount. The pattern of the rain. Nicholas's inability to hold a position under pressure applied here as everywhere else. Ministers who opposed Rasputin found themselves replaced with ministers who tolerated him. The appointment and dismissal of Russia's senior officials, accelerating through the war years, began to move at a rhythm that seemed connected to Alexandra's correspondence with a peasant in Siberia, rather than to any principle of governance. It was called, with bitter wit, the ministerial leapfrog. 4 different men held the post of Interior Minister in 1916 alone. By December of 1916, a group of men who believed they were saving the Romanov dynasty by removing the cancer they felt was destroying it, had formed around Prince Felix Yusupov, young, wealthy, connected by marriage to the imperial family, and convinced with the absolute certainty of a man who has not thought carefully enough about what happens after his plan succeeds. They invited Rasputin to the basement of the Usurper palace on the night of the 16th of December with a promise that Felix's wife, who Rasputin admired, would be there. She would not be there. What would be there was food and wine laced with cyanide potassium, enough, the conspirators had been assured by a physician among them, to kill several men. Rasputin ate the cakes, he drank the wine. He sat in the low-lit basement room with its Persian carpets and its decorative fireplace while the gramophone played upstairs, and the conspirators waited above for the sounds of a man dying. The sounds did not come. Yusupov descended after 2 hours to find Rasputin sitting in his chair, alive, complaining that the wine was making his throat burn. The cyanide had done nothing that cyanide was supposed to do, and this fact, this single, physiologically inexplicable fact, sent something close to genuine terror through the men upstairs when Felix returned to report it. One of them, Vladimir Purishkevich, said afterward that in that moment he felt they were dealing with something that was not entirely natural. Yusupov returned to the basement with a revolver and shot Rasputin in the back at close range. The conspirators came down. The body was checked. They began to prepare for disposal. Rasputin moved. He rose from the floor and seized Yusupov by the shoulder and spoke, reportedly said Felix's name, before Yusupov tore free and ran up the stairs screaming. Rasputin shot through the back, dragged himself up the stairs and through a courtyard door and out into the December night of St. Petersburg, crawling through the snow. Purishkevich pursued him and shot him again, twice more, and this time the body did not rise. He was wrapped in a blue curtain, transported to the Malaya Nevka River, and pushed through a hole in the ice. He died by drowning. The lungs contained water. Whatever the poison and the bullets had failed to finish, the river completed, and the most disruptive figure in the history of the Romanov court sank into the black water beneath the St. Petersburg ice on a December night in 1916. Among his papers, a letter was found that he had written to the Tsar. In it he stated plainly what he believed would follow his death. If he were killed by peasants, Russia would survive. But if he were killed by members of the nobility, by boyars, by princes, by men of the class that Yusupov represented, then none of the Tsar's family would survive more than 2 years. Russia would be consumed in blood and chaos, and the Romanovs would fall. He was killed on December 16th, 1916. The Tsar's family would be dead by July 17th, 1918. The gap between those two dates is 18 months. The shadow was gone. But the palace it had haunted was already hollow, already emptied of the authority and legitimacy that a dynasty needs to survive a storm. And the storm that was coming was not the work of any mystic or any conspiracy of princes. It was the work of millions of exhausted, hungry, furious people, and of the systematic logic of a revolution that had been building for longer than anyone in the Alexander Palace had been willing to see. The new year of 1917 was 10 days away. Somewhere in Switzerland, a man in a small apartment was reading the newspapers and waiting for his moment with the patience of someone who has understood that history, once it begins to move, moves faster than anyone expects. The letter was a prophecy, but the fire that would burn the Romanovs had been lit long before the poison reached Rasputin's lips. To see how the palace grew so hollow, and why the Russian people had finally run out of patience, we have to look back to the moment the world caught fire. 3 years before the Siberian monk was pushed beneath the ice, a single spark in the Balkans had already set a countdown in motion that no Tsar could stop. The summer of 1914 arrived in Europe like a lit fuse, and before anyone had fully understood what was burning, the continent was at war. The immediate cause, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo on a June afternoon, was the kind of spark that history produces when enough combustible material has been accumulating for long enough that almost any spark would have done. The alliance systems that European diplomats had spent decades constructing as guarantees of stability revealed themselves in the space of 6 weeks to be guarantees of the opposite, mechanisms for ensuring that a regional murder in the Balkans became a continental catastrophe. Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France and Britain followed. The machinery of industrial warfare, activated for the first time at continental scale, began processing human beings at a rate that the men who built the machinery had not permitted themselves to fully imagine in advance. Russia entered the war with the enthusiasm that governments manufacture when they need populations to accept sacrifices that have not yet revealed their true dimensions. There were crowds in Petrograd. The city had renamed itself from the German-sounding St. Petersburg at the war's outbreak, a gesture of patriotic feeling that would look poignant in retrospect, waving flags and singing hymns outside the Winter Palace, while Nicholas appeared on a balcony and received their adoration with the expression of a man who was for once doing the thing his role required of him in a way that seemed to fit. The enthusiasm did not survive contact with the reality of what Russia was sending its men into. The peasants who filled the ranks of the Russian army in 1914 and 1915 and 1916 were not equipped for modern industrial warfare. Some of them arrived at the front without rifles, with instructions to pick up the weapon of the man beside them when that man was killed. Some arrived without boots, their feet wrapped in cloth. The supply system, dependent on a railway network that was insufficient for the scale of what was being asked of it, broke down repeatedly and catastrophically. Medical care for the wounded was organized with a medieval inadequacy that the sheer volume of casualties, millions in the first year alone, made worse with every offensive. The officers commanding these men were often products of a military culture that valued social standing over tactical competence, and the strategies they employed frequently consisted of sending large numbers of men across open ground toward prepared positions and recording the results. The results were catastrophic. Russia lost more men in the First World War than any other nation. The numbers are difficult to hold in the mind because they are too large for ordinary emotional processing. Estimates of Russian military deaths range from 1.7 to 2 million, with total casualties including wounded and captured reaching numbers several times that. Behind the front, the economy strained and then cracked under the weight of total war conducted by a government that had not modernized its administrative capacity to match its military ambitions. Inflation eroded wages. Supply chains collapsed. The bread that Russian cities depended on became scarce, and then scarcer, and the lines that formed outside bakeries in Petrograd in the winter of 1916 into 1917 grew longer and colder and more desperate with every week that passed. Nicholas made, in the summer of 1915, a decision that his advisors and ministers and even his closest family members pleaded with him not to make. He dismissed the commander-in-chief of the Russian army and took command himself, moving his headquarters to the front and leaving the administration of the empire in Petrograd. Leaving it, in practical terms, to Alexandra, and Alexandra, isolated and consumed by Alexei's health and her faith in Rasputin, was by this point making governmental decisions, or more precisely channeling Rasputin's preferences into governmental decisions, with a freedom that no empress in the structure of Russian autocracy was supposed to exercise. The ministers who remained in Petrograd wrote letters of increasing desperation to the Tsar at the front, describing what they were seeing. Nicholas read them and wrote reassuring replies and did not come home. The connection between the man who held the formal authority and the government that was supposed to express it had become, by 1916, largely notional. On the 23rd of February 1917, the women of Petrograd's textile factories went on strike. They had been standing in bread lines since before dawn, in temperatures that sat well below freezing, and they had come to work hungry, and they walked out into the street and began to march, and other workers joined them, and within 2 days something that had begun as a bread riot was becoming something larger and less containable. The critical moment came when the soldiers sent to suppress the demonstrations refused. This is the hinge on which the February Revolution turned. Not ideology, not organization, not the presence of revolutionary leadership, but the simple human fact that the young men with rifles looked at the frozen, hungry, furious crowd in front of them and could not make themselves fire. Many of them had mothers and sisters in similar lines in other cities. Many of them had not eaten properly in days. They lowered their weapons. Some of them joined the march. When soldiers stop obeying, the authority that gives the orders has already ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. What remained was paperwork. Nicholas was on his imperial train, attempting to return to Petrograd from the front, when the railway workers rerouted him and then stopped the train entirely at the town of Pskov, where his generals came to meet him. What they told him was delivered with military directness and the particular awkwardness of men who have decided to do something irrevocable and are past the point of reconsidering. The army could not be used to restore order in Petrograd. The army would not follow orders to fire on Russian civilians. The situation could not be resolved. He needed to abdicate. Nicholas asked whether there was any alternative. He was told there was not. He considered this for what witnesses described as a surprisingly brief time, an almost eerie brevity, and then he asked for a pen. He signed the abdication document on the 2nd of March, 1917, transferring the throne to his brother Michael, and then, when Michael refused it within 24 hours, ending the Romanov dynasty's 300-year claim to Russian governance with the scratching of a pen on a sheet of paper. Witnesses described his demeanor as calm, not the stoic calm of a man mastering great internal anguish, but something closer to the calm of a man from whose shoulders an unbearable weight has just been removed. He signed away 3 centuries of history and then went for a walk and wrote in his diary that the weather had been fine. The provisional government that replaced him was composed of liberal politicians who believed that Russia could fight a democratic war, maintain the front, and build a constitutional state simultaneously. They were wrong about at least 2 of these things, and the months following the abdication demonstrated the wrongness with gathering speed. The sealed train crossed through Germany in April of 1917. Germany had arranged the transit deliberately and with strategic calculation. The man inside the train was a committed revolutionary who had spent years in Swiss exile waiting for exactly this moment, and Germany correctly understood that returning him to Russia was likely to accelerate the collapse of a country they were fighting. The train was sealed. No contact with German citizens along the route, no exchange of any kind, and it carried Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history as Lenin, from Zurich to the Finland station in Petrograd. He arrived on the night of April 3rd to red flags and crowds, and the disorganized enthusiasm of people who'd made a revolution, without being entirely sure what they wanted the revolution to become. He stepped onto the platform and almost immediately climbed onto an armored car and gave a speech that told everyone listening that the provisional government was worthless. The war had to end immediately, and the revolution was only beginning. The April Theses, as his program became known, called for precisely what the exhausted, hungry, war-broken population of Russia most wanted to hear: peace, land, and bread. He said what everyone else was thinking and no one else with power was saying. This, in a moment of revolutionary possibility, is the most dangerous thing a person can do. The Romanov family was moved east, away from Petrograd and its increasingly volatile politics, first to Tobolsk in Siberia, and then, as the Bolsheviks consolidated power through the autumn of 1917, and into 1918, further east still, to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains, to a merchant's house that the local Bolshevik authorities had requisitioned and renamed, with a bureaucratic grimness that contained in retrospect a kind of dark prophecy, the House of Special Purpose. Nicholas and Alexandra and their 5 children arrived in Yekaterinburg in the spring of 1918. The windows of the house were painted over so they could not see out. The guards were changed regularly so none of them would form attachments to the prisoners. The family adapted to the routine of captivity with a patience that their letters and diaries describe. The children's lessons continuing, Nicholas reading aloud in the evenings, the girls sewing and practicing music. They were waiting for something, though none of them said clearly what. Liberation, perhaps, a negotiated exile to England, which had been discussed and then quietly abandoned by a British government that did not want the political complication of hosting deposed Russian royalty. Or simply the resolution, one way or another, of a situation that the Bolshevik leadership in Moscow was also watching and considering and deciding what to do about. The summer of 1918 arrived in Yekaterinburg. The White Army, fighting the Bolsheviks in the civil war that had engulfed Russia, was approaching. Decisions were made in Moscow and telegraphed to Yekaterinburg in cipher. On the night of July 16th, 1918, the family was told to prepare themselves. There would be a photograph, they were told, to document their continued safety for official purposes. They should dress and come downstairs. They came downstairs. They walked into a silence so heavy it felt final. There was no storm over Yekaterinburg that night, no omen in the sky to signal the end of a 300-year-old dynasty. For 78 days the family had clung to the dignity of their routine, the gardening, the lessons, the prayers. But as Nicholas carried his son down those narrow, dark stairs, the ordinary world was already vanishing, replaced by the stark reality of the basement below. Nicholas had been gardening in the small yard. The girls had been sewing. Alexei, who had injured his knee and could barely walk, spent much of his time in bed or in a wheelchair, and his father carried him when carrying was needed, which was the same thing Nicholas had always done, and perhaps the only role in his life he'd ever felt fully adequate to. They went to sleep that night in the ordinary way. They did not know it was the last time. Shortly after midnight, the house commandant Yakov Yurovsky entered the family's rooms and told them to get up and dress. It was for their safety, he explained. The White Army was advancing on Yekaterinburg. There had been shooting in the city. They were to be moved to a more secure location, and a photograph would be taken first, documentation of their well-being for official purposes, to counter false rumours that they had already been killed. The family dressed in the dark. Alexandra asked for chairs to be brought to the basement room for herself and Alexei, because standing for long periods was difficult for both of them. Yurovsky arranged for 2 chairs to be brought down. This detail, the chairs, has stayed with historians because of what it reveals about those final minutes, that the family believed enough in the photograph story to ask for a practical accommodation, that they were thinking about comfort, about Alexei's knee, about the ordinary logistics of standing in a room while a camera was prepared. They walked down the narrow stairs into the basement and arranged themselves as Yurovsky directed, and they waited. The room was small. It had recently been a storage space with a low ceiling and a floor of uneven wooden boards, lit by a single electric bulb that threw a flat yellow light over everything. There was a striped wallpaper on one wall. Nicholas stood in the front with Alexei, whose leg made standing difficult, held against him. Alexandra sat in her chair to one side. The four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria and Anastasia, arranged themselves nearby. The family doctor, the cook, the maid, and the footman who had stayed with them into captivity stood at the edges of the group. 11 people in a room not much larger than a modest sitting room. Yurovsky returned with a group of men and unfolded a piece of paper and began to read. Nicholas, perhaps not hearing clearly, perhaps not processing what was happening quickly enough, turned to ask his family something. Witnesses disagree on whether it was a question or a statement, and then turned back to Yurovsky and said in Russian, "Что? Что? What? What?" Yurovsky did not repeat himself. He nodded, and the men behind him raised their weapons. The room was too small for what happened in it. The sound was enormous and immediate. A compression of noise in a confined space that was less like a sequence of shots and more like a single catastrophic event, and the smoke from the weapons filled the room within seconds, and through the smoke the chaos of those minutes was such that even the participants, in their later accounts, described it in fragments rather than sequence. What emerged from those fragments, assembled by historians over decades, is a picture of something that did not go as planned. Because the daughters did not fall correctly, did not die in the time that had been allocated to dying, continued to move and to make sounds that the men in the room had not expected to continue. The reason was sewn into their clothing, in the months before the arrest, when the possibility of what was coming was not yet certain, but was no longer impossible to imagine. Alexandra and the girls had concealed the family's remaining jewellery by sewing diamonds and gemstones into the bodices and undergarments of their dresses, creating, without intending to, a crude form of armour that deflected or slowed several of the bullets that struck them. The suffering this caused in those final minutes is not something that needs to be described at length. It is enough to say that it extended what should have been immediate, and that the men in the room used bayonets to complete what the bullets had not finished, and that the whole of it lasted considerably longer than the 11 minutes, which is the most conservative estimate. By the time it was over, the wallpapered wall was destroyed, and the floor was dark, and Yurovsky's men carried the bodies out into the waiting night. The disposal was planned and then improvised and then revised, in the way that plans made under pressure always are. The bodies were driven to the Koptyaki forest, several miles from the city, and an attempt was made to destroy them with acid and fire in a mine shaft. The destruction was incomplete. After 2 days of effort, the decision was made to bury most of the remains in a shallow pit, dug into a muddy road, where the disturbed ground would be obscured by the vehicle traffic that passed over it. 2 of the bodies, almost certainly Alexei and one of his sisters, likely Maria or Anastasia, were buried separately, burned more thoroughly, in a location some distance from the others. Then silence descended. The Soviet state did not confirm what had happened at Yekaterinburg. It acknowledged eventually that Nicholas had been shot, that the family had been moved for their safety, that the details were complicated and the records incomplete. The incomplete records were not an accident. The silence was not an accident. For 7 decades, the official position on what had happened to the children of the last Tsar shifted between evasion and active denial, and the families and descendants of those who had known the Romanovs carried their knowledge or their suspicions through the Soviet century in the private way that dangerous knowledge is carried, carefully, quietly, without official confirmation. The grave on the Koptyaki Road was found in 1979 by a filmmaker and amateur historian named Geli Ryabov, who had been researching the execution for years and had obtained, through sources whose identities required protection, enough information to identify the approximate location. He excavated quietly, confirmed what he had found, and reburied the remains and said nothing publicly for a decade, because the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union, and what he had found was not the kind of a discovery that the Soviet Union would have received well. The formal excavation came in 1991, as the Soviet state was dissolving, and the secrets it had maintained were becoming, one by one, possible to speak aloud. 9 skeletons were recovered from the road grave. DNA testing, conducted with the meticulous patience of forensic science, applied to a question that the 20th century had been waiting 3/4 of a century to answer, confirmed the identities through living relatives of the Romanov family, including Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose grandmother had been Alexandra's sister, Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of the 4 daughters, the doctor, the cook, the maid, the footman. The 2 missing children, Alexei and one of his sisters, were found at the second burial site in 2007, identified by DNA analysis that was by then precise enough to be considered definitive. The question of which daughter had been buried separately was answered. It was Maria, not Anastasia, which meant that the decades of rumours and claims and the extraordinary case of the woman known as Anna Anderson, who had insisted for most of the 20th century that she was the surviving Grand Duchess Anastasia, were given their final answer. Anna Anderson's DNA, tested after her death, matched that of a German aristocratic family with a history of mental illness. She was not Anastasia. Anastasia was in the ground outside Yekaterinburg. She'd been there since July of 1918. The family was buried together in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg in July of 1998, exactly 80 years after the night in the basement. The cathedral is where the Romanov Tsars had been buried since the time of Peter the Great, the same cathedral whose golden spire pierces the Baltic sky above the city that Peter built on bones, that Catherine filled with art, that Nicholas had watched from a distance while his dynasty consumed itself. The Romanov circle closed there in that cathedral on a summer day, with the Russian state paying the official respects that history requires, even when, perhaps especially when, history is complicated and the respects are overdue. And here, at the end of 300 years, is where the story asks to be held for a moment before it is set down. A 16-year-old boy, weeping in a monastery, begging to be spared the crown. An empire built from that reluctant beginning, built with the forced labour of serfs, the military genius of Peter, the intellectual fire of Catherine, the vast patience of the Russian land itself, which absorbed invasions and absorbed them and remained. Built through plague and famine and war and revolution, and the particular variety of self-destruction that seems to afflict dynasties when they've existed long enough to mistake their own permanence for inevitability. Was it a tragedy of fate? There is a version of the Romanov story in which the dynasty was doomed from its beginning by the structural impossibilities of its position. Too vast, country to govern well, too many competing forces to satisfy, the gap between autocratic power and modern governance too wide to cross without revolution as the bridge. In this version, what happened in the basement of the Ipatiev house was the inevitable conclusion of historical forces that no individual decision could have altered, the final scene of a drama whose ending was written into its opening. Was it a tragedy of choice? There is another version in which dozens of decisions made by specific people at specific moments might have bent the trajectory differently. If Alexander II had lived to sign his consultative commission, if Nicholas had possessed his father's firmness or his great-great-grandfather's vision, if the window of reform had been opened earlier, wider, more genuinely, if the distance between the dynasty and its people had been shorter, if the Tsar who danced on the night of Kodinka had understood what that dance cost him, if the little father had met his people in the snow instead of leaving soldiers to face them, perhaps both versions are true. Perhaps the Romanov dynasty was the product of a particular historical moment that lasted exactly as long as history allowed it to last, and the individuals inside it were simultaneously the agents of their choices and the prisoners of their circumstances, as all of us are, moving through our moment in the world without quite being able to see the shape of what we are living inside. What begins in a monastery ended in a basement. What was built over 300 years on snow and sacrifice and human will, extraordinary, terrible, magnificent, came to rest in a shallow grave in a forest outside a provincial city, and then finally in the cathedral by the Baltic Sea where the winter light comes through the windows in the long afternoons and falls across the stone floors and asks nothing of anyone and remembers everything.